4.5, solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. Now, before we can actually use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations, we need to figure out what it is. So, start by considering any quadratic equation in standard form. That would be ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. If we were going to solve that for the x, we could do that by completing the square. So keep in mind your steps for completing the square. We would need all the variables on one side, and we would need our constant on the other. So I'm going to subtract c from both sides of my equation. That's going to leave us with ax squared plus bx equals negative c. Now, at this point in time, if I want to complete the square, I need my leading coefficient to be positive 1, which means I have to get rid of this a. So I'm going to divide everybody by a. If I do that, that's going to leave me with x squared plus b divided by a times x equals negative c divided by a. Now, I know this isn't pretty, but we do now have it set up that we can complete the square because we have all of our x's on the left, we have all of our variables, or our numbers, on the right, and our leading coefficient is a positive 1. So at this point, we're going to add our blanks, and we're going to say x squared plus b over ax plus blank equals negative c over a plus blank. Then we need to find our b value, which is the coefficient in front of the x term, and we're going to cut it in half. So we have b over a cut in half, which is actually b over 2a. We circle that, and then we square it. Now, if you're squaring this, you're taking the numerator times the numerator and the denominator times the denominator, which is b times b, which is b squared, over 2a times 2a, which is 4a squared. And then if you add it on the left, we're going to add it on the right, which is b squared over 4a squared. Now, from here, we factor. And keep in mind, this just factors into x, and then this thing in the circle, positive b over 2a, just falls into place, squared, equals, and then this is where we're going to get a little more complicated. So, at this point in time, we need to add these together, or because this is a negative c, we need to subtract these, but in order to do that, I need a common denominator. Well, the common denominator between an a and a 4a squared is actually 4a squared. If I look at the one over here on the right, 4a squared, I'm keeping it 4a squared, so I'm not changing anything, so my numerator is still going to be b squared. Now, on this one, I'm going from an a to a 4a squared. Well, ask yourself, what do you have to multiply a by in order to get 4a squared? And the answer to that is you need another 4a. So 4a times a is 4a squared. And what you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So if I'm taking negative c times 4a, that's negative 4ac. Now, at this point, I have a common denominator. So down here in my answer, my denominator is going to be 4a squared. My numerator, I have a negative 4ac plus b squared, which I'm actually going to rearrange just a little bit, and I'm going to write my positive b squared first, and then I'm going to subtract my 4ac. At this point in time, we would solve by square root. So there's my squared. I'm going to take the square root of the left. I'm going to take the square root of the right. And keep in mind, you have to square root the whole thing. Over here, the square root cancels the squared, and we have x plus b over 2a equals. The next thing I'm considering is I'm taking a square root. And keep in mind, when we do this, we actually have two answers. We have a positive version and a negative version. So we're going to have plus or minus. I'm not going to write it as two separate equations. I'm going to keep it together. And then I'm also going to write my square root as the square root of the numerator, which is b squared, minus 4ac over the square root of my denominator, which is 4a squared. Now, if I take that one step further, I'm going to leave my left side for now, x plus b over 2a equals, keep my plus or minus, and then I'm going to simplify if I can. So I'm looking at my denominator and I have the square root of 4a squared. Well, this all together, this is a 2a times a 2a, so that can just become 2a. If I look at my numerator, I know you really want to take the square root of b squared, but you can't do that because it's attached with this minus sign to this 4ac. And even though it looks like 4 might break down, a and c most definitely will not. They don't have squares on them, so you can't take the square root of the numerator, and we're going to leave it as the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Now, remember in what we were actually trying to do here is we were trying to solve this very generic equation with our a, b, and c values for x. Well, x is right here, and I still need to get it alone, so I'm going to subtract b over 2a from both sides. So it goes away here, and we have x equals. Now, if I look over at this huge thing that I'm sitting with right now, do you notice that they have a common denominator? So whatever my answer is here, I know that my common denominator is going to be 2a. Then I'm going to look at this and I have a negative b, and then I have a plus or minus. So I'm going to take my negative b and I'm going to put it in front, negative b. I'm going to then keep my plus or minus, which is out front here, of my square root of b squared, and at this point I'm going to write that in parentheses, minus 4ac, and we have x by itself. This is the quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a, and this will solve any quadratic equation for any given a value, b value, and c value.